Good morning, virtual visitors. Thank you for joining us. My name is Shakia Gillette. I'm the director of the African American History Initiative here at the Missouri Historical Society. Welcome to our program, and thank you for joining us for this Juneteenth presentation. In light of our current circumstances, we would like to take a moment of silence in remembrance of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and every Black body that has died at the hands of police brutality and racism. Thank you. This morning's presentation featuring Dr. Chris Tenson will discuss the memory, history, and legacy of Juneteenth, its significance to the study of American history, and its relevance to the contemporary struggles for justice. Before we get started, we would like to thank our members, donors, and supporters of the Zoo Museum Tax District. Thank you. Today's program will run for about 60 minutes, which includes a 45-minute presentation and a 10-minute Q&A. For your convenience, you can submit questions through the Q&A button and the toolbar. And in order to streamline the process, we would prefer for you to wait till the end of the program to submit your questions. Please know that we will do our very best to get to all of your questions, but we may not have time to get to everyone, so please just work with us. Lastly, we are providing closed captioning today. To turn it on, you can scroll to the closed caption button along the toolbar on your screen. At this time, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker and kick off today's program. Dr. Christopher M. Tenson is currently an associate professor of African Studies and History at St. Louis University, where he is the director of the African American Studies program. His research and teaching focuses on histories of Africana radical traditions, U.S. ethnic studies, critical media studies, incarceration, and race and sports. His writings and reviews have been published in The Black Scholar, The Feminist Wire, Radical Teacher, Equity and Excellence in Education, Souls, and Counterpunch. His first book, entitled Radical Intellect, Liberator Magazine, and Black Activism in the 1960s, is published on the UNC Press and was the winner of the inaugural Pauli Murray Prize for Best Book in African American Intellectual History from the Professor Tenson is a highly sought after speaker and mentor who has led professional development workshops and lectured at numerous college campuses, high schools, and institutions out the country. He is an avid lover of basketball, used bookstores, and good coffee. So at this time, I am going to turn our program over to our guest speaker. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and thank you for joining us. Dr. Tenson?
Thank you so much, Shakia, for having me.
You are welcome.
I'm certainly glad to be here for this occasion. I want to start off with a caveat, and I want to make sure that we understand this is not necessarily about convincing anyone that something is wrong. It's not about convincing anyone about anything in particular, but it is about thinking about how and what we are going to do and support for the rest of our lives. The history of slavery is arguably the most important issue to study in American history. Its ghosts and its structuring are lived today. For George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Tony McDade, the recent sparks of this current movement. And to those who have fallen since then, and for those who will unfortunately fall next week, seeing as Blackness and death seem to be linked in this society. In fact, just yesterday, a headline read, California city residents demand answers after a Black man is found hanging from a tree. This is 2020, not 1920. But we're here to talk about holidays and Juneteenth. And because of that, we also have to think about the history of enslavement and related matters. But first, let's think about why holidays and commemorative holidays and why they're important And they're important in some ways to memorialize things that we care about, things that we have a shared vision of or a shared interest in. They tend to link us in a common political and cultural vocabulary, even as they fail to fully unify us. People forget that white Americans, including many public officials, objected to a Martin Luther King holiday when it was first proposed. But of course, with American revisionism, somehow today, everyone ends up on the right side of history and has always supported Dr. King, which we know that has not been the case. But it's a convenient history that we like to tell ourselves, so we feel good about why we live, and feel good about that. But it's a convenient one. And in fact, were it not for Stevie Wonder, yes, that's Stevie Wonder, we probably wouldn't have a King holiday that's celebrated at the federal level. And in fact, if you want more information on just the way in which we revise American history to serve our own interests, there's a wonderful book by one of my colleagues at Brooklyn College, Jane Theo-Harris, called A More Beautiful and Terrible History, The Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History, in which she challenges Americans to see a much more inconvenient history. So if we can move ahead in our slides, I wanted to just start that way so that we understand our moment, we understand the role of history in our moment, and the fact that this is a serious moment. And even though slavery is difficult to talk about, we must talk about it because that lays the foundation for how we got to this point. What we want to do today is review history of enslavement in the Midwest and Texas in particular. We'll say a little bit about St. Louis and Missouri for sure. Rediscover some African-American freedom claims. We want to understand the Atlantic slave trade and the US domestic slave trade, revisit the relationship between enslavement and policing, and hopefully we can all arrive at a new commitment for justice and reparation through the celebration of Juneteenth. All right, we can move ahead, please. That was the caveat that I gave at the beginning of our meeting today. Next slide, please. There should be a study that shows there on that slide. I don't know why that's not coming up. But this is a poll, in fact, that I don't know why it's not there. But that's a poll. There's supposed to be a poll there that shows the way in which Americans think about, and we can freeze it here, think about the question of reparations. And what it shows is that there's a great disparity when we talk about reparations. And this was a study that was done at Johns Hopkins and another university teaming up to do a study a couple of years ago, thinking about this question of reparations when it was put back on the national radar. Actually, it was last year, put back on the national radar when there was testimony at Congress about this very question of reparations for slavery. And of course, as I mentioned, it's the most important, but it's the least favorite things for Americans to talk about, especially white Americans. Because of this disparity, 75% of African Americans support reparations, according to this study, while only 15% of white Americans do. So make no mistake about it, it's in fact, those numbers indicate who has been holding up the question of reparations, but also the broader conversation on race and racial justice. What interests are being protected there is what we have to think about. Why have folks been resistant, and why have people refused to accept culpability for the lack of traction on such discussions? But it did get congressional attention last year, and we'll see where the conversation continues. But I can make those charts available to you after this conversation. But I raise this to reorient us once again to the fact that Americans are more comfortable talking about slavery and asking in myriad ways that Black people forget slavery than they are about actually acknowledging and supporting economic and structural remedies. Even though there are people in the streets now, more than ever, calling for redress, it remains to be seen if this will lead to the structural changes that have been called for since the end of the Civil War and long before that. We have to remember, however, that Black or African American history in particular did not begin in slavery. And so while I want to encourage folks to study and revisit the pre-enslavement past of African people on your own, I would like to show just a few maps to remind us of what we're talking about. So we'll scroll ahead. Do we not have our maps there? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. If
They
you
were
all
there.
could just bear with us for a second.
They were there in the test run we just did.
They were. We may have to.
Can we go bootleg version?
Yeah, I think we may have to
Let's
do it
go
this way.
Let's see.
Yeah, the map is not.
Keep going. Nothing's coming up?
Mm-mm.
All right, so just put the camera on me and then I will talk us through all of this,
Okay.
if that's okay with our guests.
Would you
We have-
like me to stop sharing the slides?
Sure, that's fine. Because if nothing's gonna show up, then
Yeah.
it doesn't work. All right, sorry folks. We just tested it out and it did work. We were prepared. We did our homework, just so you know. Don't be talking about Black people. Don't talk about Black people like that. All right, let me just continue. And but it's good to have some visuals. And again, I'll make this presentation available to folks once we're done. But the maps that we have in the slides there basically show the kind of origins, the pre-slavery origins of people of African descent and the African continent and the changes that occurred on the African continent and the civilizations that existed prior to this thing called transatlantic slavery. We're talking about Mali and Ghana and Songhai and Benin, right? And so the point is that we have to continue to teach that Black history didn't just begin in slavery, even though we're going to talk a lot about slavery and Juneteenth comes out of that particular experience. There's actually a longer history that we have to be mindful of, okay? So those are some of the maps that we can imagine. There's other maps that show the kind of technological enhancement, the trade, the mapping, and the way in which maps, in fact, and these trade routes across the Atlantic and across the world, in fact, really shape the society we have. And I like to have a visual with that so we understand actually what is being created when we think about the transatlantic slave trade. Unfortunately, maps also only tell us part of the story. So part of the story is about the trade routes, and it's interesting for us to see that. The other part is to see the bodies who were extracted and where they actually wound up. And I point that out because even though we're in North America, we tend to think North America was the central focus of the slavery enterprise. Actually, 90% of the people extracted from the African continent, 90% of them wound up in Brazil, just to give you a sense, okay? But like I said, maps don't tell us everything. They don't record the brutality of each route, the choppiness of the sea, the routine and inventive violence that was carried out, extracting human beings, dislodging them, relocating them. Transatlantic slavery, after all, was violently, and some might say gratuitously, extractive. Enslavement of African people formed the foundation of modern economic development in the West. And I'm a historian, I'm a scholar, so I'm gonna always refer you to books that I'm inspired by. And there's a wonderful book that came out in the 80s, might have been the late 70s, in fact. It's a wonderful and unflinching book, and you should definitely check it out if you can get your hands on it. by an African writer, Nigerian writer named Chinua. And the book was called simply The West and the Rest of Us. Okay. So check that book out if you get a chance. Are we still trying to locate our slides?
Yes, just keep talking. I'm going to get it to work.
Sounds good. I will try to be as poetic and as picturesque as possible, okay? So The West and the Rest of Us is a wonderful book about the way in which history, you know, and the African political history and cultural history dealing with European colonialism, right? And so it's a wonderful and unflinching read. But you know, when we're thinking about transatlantic slavery, it's one thing if we're thinking about just objects, right? We're trading, but we're talking about human beings, right? Whose extraction through force and incentivized violence, both bodily and psychic, became unfortunate but foundational members of the Western world. So here's some statistics for us to think about. In his book, Reversing Sail, the historian Michael Gomez offers some statistical data as regards this extraction, writing, quote, "Of all the voyages for which there is data between the years 1662 and 1867, nearly 90% of captive Africans wound up in Brazil and the Caribbean. Brazil alone imported 40% of the total trade. The English and the French Caribbean received 37%, the Spanish dominated Caribbean 10%, and North America roughly 7%. Right? So even though we focus a lot here in this country, right, and see slavery as central to our identity, and it certainly is, in terms of the global landscape of extraction, North America represented 7% over that period, 1662 to 1867, right? And what these maps are good for, they also hide, right? So they also hide the damage, and they also hide the fact that many of these folks resisted at every turn. And there's gonna be a theme throughout our remaining time about this question of resistance. And I just wanna give a snapshot of the way in which the Caribbean in particular, with all of those African imports, quote unquote, that we just read, right, that we just heard about, 40%, right, 37%, 10%, right? That's a large number of folks moving through the Caribbean. Obviously, you're gonna have a lot of resistance, right? They didn't always rise to the level of conspiracy that would be recorded in papers, but frequently they actually did. In Jamaica, for example, one report from 1737, right, said that Negroes of many British plantations had of late been possessed with a dangerous spirit of liberty, having already risen up in Antigua and threatened to do it in the rest of the sugar plantations. That was one headline in the newspaper in that period. The early 18th century saw the intensification of rebellion and organized escape throughout the Western Hemisphere. This would include, of course, North America, and there's numerous reports of the enslaved in Virginia and Louisiana, for example, rebelling openly with weapons, whatever they could get their hands on. South Carolina, of course, witnessed and also repressed the Stono Rebellion of 1739, which is perhaps a little bit better known. But all over the Caribbean, St. John Island revolt in 1733, Antigua in 1736, similar uprisings in St. Bart's, St. Martin, St. Kitts, right? You can see that these were not the vacation spots that they would become, or where the 1% would be able to hide their money in many decades later. These were spaces of rebellion. But I should also add, of course, since we're thinking about Juneteenth and commemorating liberation, that in many of these places that I just identified, Black folks there are conscious of their history and have annual celebrations on these islands amongst Black folk to celebrate the rebellion that was there. And many of these folks have statues to rebellion leaders. All right, so let's talk more about locations. One thing I always like to point out when we're thinking about slavery, when we're teaching about slavery, is that, you know, there tends to be a periodization where people say, well, okay, well, transatlantic slavery happened over this period of time. And once the slave trade was banned, then that led to the domestic slave trade. And that's only partially true. What I tend to argue and teach my students is that domestic slave trading was always attendant to transatlantic slavery. So when someone was brought into Baltimore, brought into Richmond, Virginia, they could very well be brought in there, but spend most of their life or grow up in New Orleans, for example, right? And so that's, large amount of space in between those locations. But nonetheless, that was from the very beginning of this process. So it wasn't that they just, after 1807, then the domestic slave trade started. No, it was exacerbated then after that period from 1810 to about 1860, 50 odd years. But that wasn't its starting point. So I always wanted to make sure we understand that. As I mentioned, you could be enslaved, you could be bought in Virginia, but grow up in New Orleans, grow up in parts of Mississippi. So this was very routine, and it was part of the enterprise itself. So what I'm trying to impress upon you so far is just to think about Juneteenth's broader origins, okay? We understand by now, we should at least, that Juneteenth marks the arrival of General Granger into the island city of Galveston. And I always like to point out Galveston as an island city. Folks who are not from Texas, which I am not, probably don't know the geography of Texas as much as people from that area. But Galveston is actually an island city, which is just off the immediate coast of, are we back up? No? Okay.
Yes.
Off the immediate coast. Okay, here we go. Good stuff. All right, can we forward? Actually, stay right there for 1 second. We can see on this map here where on the west coast of Africa, the arrow is pointing to what's happening across the Atlantic. And we see these millions of humans being disembarked in the West Indies, so-called West Indies, but also Central America, South America, right, and North America, and even Europe, right? Okay, we can fast forward there. Next slide, please. All right, so I like to point this out because this is one of the conventional people, the way people think about the continent of Africa. So if you think about that extraction that we saw in the map previously, and then we see how, what ensued in the 19th century is really, the dividing up of Africa completely, right? And these are not ruled in total by local African peoples. These are European, colonizers essentially taking over, carving up parts of Africa. We probably well know, people on this call will know about the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885, where basically the rulemaking for breaking up Africa amongst European colonial powers was set up. All right, next slide, please. Here's the map that we were talking about. And I just want to focus on the Gulf of Mexico here in our upper left piece, because that's where, we want to make sure people understand the geography and its relationship, because all of this would impact both the rebellions that would happen in the Caribbean, the potential for rebellion that would happen in North America, as well as the actual trade. And finally, the development of Black communities, African communities in Mexico, in Cuba, in Belize, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. Trying to get us caught up to where my thinking is at. All right, so here's what I was mentioning in terms of the domestic slave trade in the years of 1810 to 1860, rough estimates of years that help us to understand. We see we're right up there. St. Louis is right up there at the top, upper left as a key space for slave trading activity. Kentucky, right? Nashville, so this is the mapping that where hundreds of thousands of African Americans were taken throughout this whole enterprise. Okay, so this was an all-encompassing enterprise, and there's pretty much, I argue that there's no state that hasn't been touched in some way by the economics or the physical presence of slavery. Even though you had Maine and Missouri come in under the Missouri Compromise, right? They came in, one slave, one free. Nonetheless, that shows you the relationship between both the slave state and the free state immediately. And we know that was about congressional representation. All right, continue, please. Okay, this is a good map to help us see where Galveston is. All right, right there facing the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's Galveston, the island city. Okay, so we see, so this is where Granger went in 1865. Okay, next slide. All right, so there's our domestic trade again. And you can see at the very bottom here, New Orleans empties right out into the Gulf of Mexico. So even though we talk about transatlantic slavery, we really could talk about the Gulf of Mexico as being this kind of, I don't want to call it a lake because it is a massive space. And those of us who travel can see that. If you've been to Florida, you know, certain parts of Tampa, you can see, I mean, it's a massive space. I don't want to call it a lake, but it was a key waterway, in fact, for both slave trading, or what I like to call slave smuggling, because a lot of people were just stolen and taken other places. Okay, next slide. And that smuggling enterprise was lucrative for the smugglers. But I want to point out too that, you know, one of the things that we have to understand is that with all of its brutality, you know, one of the clearest examples of Black people's humanity and their willing to resist was, and the fact that they weren't just docile and saying, oh, I would just sit here and wait for Jesus to come, is this idea that these runaway ads, okay? These runaway ads tell us a tremendous story. And we'll just hold this one up for a while, and then I'll give you some more detail. So we talked about Galveston, we talked about the Gulf of Mexico. Just in the sense of thinking about Galveston, Galveston had a small, by 1860, Galveston did have a small free Black population, okay? But just to give a sense of where we're at the time of the Civil War, there's about 183,000 enslaved Black people in the state of Texas. And yet Galveston, they experienced some exponential growth in the period between 1847 to 1860, which is roughly a 13-year period. And Galveston's own little population in that period went up from 280 enslaved folks to over 1,200, right? That same period saw the Black population start from 30 down to 2 free Black folk by 1860, according to historical records. In the mid-19th century, thousands of enslaved people fled their oppressors in the United States. They escaped to freedom, as we mentioned, in parts of Mexico. We know about our Underground Railroad history, but the folks in the what we call the Black Mexicans or Afro-Mexicans, also known as the Muskogos, and every year they in fact celebrate a Juneteenth to this very day. And so, you know, there's a historical record of this celebration and that consciousness there. But again, you know, if we follow the kind of xenophobic rhetoric, the us versus them, the North versus South, you know, kind of vocabulary that we've acquired in this country and the historical consciousness that we've acquired in this country, we don't see the interconnectedness, right, that would happen in a place like the Gulf of Mexico, to where you're gonna have African populations in Mexico with a consciousness of the history of enslavement. We certainly don't teach that. All right, I'll scroll ahead. So because we're running, let's go to, let's stay right there, and I'm skipping ahead in my notes, I'm sorry. Okay, so thinking about the domestic situation again. According to venerable historian, rest in peace, John Hope Franklin, who you should all know and read and celebrate. 1 in 3 enslaved persons in the Upper South after 1815 was traded out of the state. And 1 in 2 fell into the hands of slave traders and was separated from a spouse or children. While Franklin highlights the high point of domestic trade following the abolition of the slave trade across the Atlantic, as we argue, we just want to underscore that domestic slave trading was concurrent with transatlantic slavery. And we talked about some of the geography in a second. All right, let's hop ahead to Missouri, but stay there on that slide there. Folks in Missouri will, clearly know about the Dred Scott decision in 1857. And, just some of the rhetoric that came out of that decision. Blacks were an inferior order, therefore they had no rights by which white men were bound to respect, is Judge Roger B. Taney, which we probably know, everybody knows that by heart. Another judge, Peter Daniel, however, also wrote, and this just gives you a sense of the tenor of the times, right, and how Black people were seen in general. The African Negro race, he wrote, did not belong to the family of nations, but were only subjects of commerce or traffic in slaves and property, right? This is coming from the highest court. So this provided further legal ammunition, right? So if the mapping shows a kind of technological development, kind of commerce developing, and a cohering of economic enterprise, well, now we have a legal apparatus that is also a part of this mix, okay? Providing legal ammunition that bombarded Black humanity. If this represented the legal and philosophical view, the material reality was the clearest reflection of that belief. And yet Missouri's slavery history is longer than this historic case, as we should know. Prior to the Louisiana Purchase, 1680s to 1803, and this region was really under Spanish and French rule. Part of the reason why the Louisiana Purchase happened was due to the Haitian Revolution, of course, we can't forget that. But under the French and Spanish rule in the colonial period, they in fact had something called the Code Noir, right? It amounted to what became known as the Black Codes. It included past laws, prohibitions on Black people owning anything, especially guns or property, laws against miscegenation, and which is interesting and ironic in the sense that there's laws against miscegenation, but it's a law that clearly slave-owning white men did not practice, did not follow, okay? Were not obedient to. So if we could show the next slide, and then we're gonna come back to this one. So go to the next slide. And here's a quote that I think is important for us to digest. Transatlantic chattel slavery's constitution of domestic relations made kin in one direction and in the other property that could be passed between and among kin. This is the ghost in the machine of contemporary US life and politics. Whiteness then is a political project. And that's from Christina Sharp. So I want us to keep that in our mind. Kin in one direction, property in another. This was the kind of relation. You can leave that slide up for just a second. This was the relation that is framed perfectly by Professor Sharp there, okay? In 1819, 2 years before the compromise, the St. Louis Inquirer reported the view of the state of Missouri when it reported the story of a man who was beat by a mob for declaring opposition to admission of slavery into Missouri. The author noted, quote, "The story will take its run, like the story of the military election and the mob of St. Louis, which turned out the directors of the old St. Louis Bank, and will be greatly repeated by the enemies of the Missouri Territory and all those who are endeavoring to rob the Missouri people of their slaves," end quote. So embedded in slavery that up to this point, the specific section in this region, and this was from Louisiana, they actually specified a section in the legal code just under slaves, right? Which meant Black codes essentially. They made Black codes essentially made riots, revolts, and unlawful assembly a crime. So-called seditious speech was banned. And in fact, even though literacy, there was laws against literacy, as we'll see, the Liberator newspaper, the abolitionist newspaper, if folks were found with that, you could be punished in a particular kind of way. In 1825, laws of the state of Missouri banned free Black people from settling in the state, a practice that continued through the 1840s. It protected slavery and at the same time restricted free Black mobility. People of color could pass through the state, But if they did, they had to produce a certificate of citizenship. So we could see where some of the rhetoric that we have today is rooted in 18th and 19th century practice, right? If they failed to produce that certificate of citizenship, then they had to immediately leave the state. Miscegenation laws, as I mentioned, who was Black was determined by whether or not you had one Black grandparent. You could have also 3 white grandparents, but if you had one Black grandparent, then you were Black, right? And clearly, if you just had one Black grandparent, you did. Kin in one direction, property in another, right? So that also, and here I'm just giving you snapshots of the lived reality for the enslaved here. The same year, 1825, the patrolling of slave quarters was legalized. These were new police that had the ability to punish by whipping up to 10 to 20 lashes and give jail time to anyone who violated the codes. By the 1840s, new laws specifying what to do with runaways was passed. And in the same period, obviously, as I mentioned, anybody found with abolitionist literature could also be punished. There was an 1847 law in Missouri that banned African-American education. It stated, no person shall keep or teach any school for the instruction of Negroes or mulattoes in reading or writing in this state, end quote, 1847. And it would, of course, take another 100 years before my institution, St. Louis University, would enroll Black students, okay? So when we think about why people are in the streets, we have to think about this as well, right? This longer history. As I mentioned, jails and imprisonment were an essential aspect of plantation life and slavery. Numerous runaway ads speak to a yearning to confine any escaped enslaved persons. One such ad, and here we can go to this slide, thank you, right on point, appreciate you. One such ad published in 1853 read that a reward would be paid for delivery in any jail in this state, right? So, I mean, again, I'm trying to impress upon us to understand any jail in this state. In this sense, the state was the prison, right? Essentially for Black people. Another, which is the slide you have in front of you now, another slave ad sums up the prison and plantation nexus completely. And I'm going to read it because it's probably hard for some of us to read, and that's a copy of a copy of a copy. It says, ran away from the subscribers living 12 miles west of Springfield, Greene County, Missouri. 2 Negroes described as follows: Arca, or Archa, belonging to James L. Alexander, is a mulatto man, some 21 years old or upwards, some 5 feet 6 inches high, has gray eyes, and plays the fiddle well. John, belonging to John A. Miller, is a rather dark complected man, some 28 years old, about 6 feet high, heavy built, weighs some 180 pounds, has a rather positive way of affirming or denying. And here's the nexus. We will give the following rewards for the apprehension and delivery of said Negroes to us in Greene County, Missouri, or if confined in any jail, so that we get them back to Missouri. That is to say, $20 each if in Greene County, if found in Greene County, $50 each if taken out of Greene County and in the state of Missouri, $230 each if taken into a free state or territory and delivered as above, $500 for legal conviction and after sentence to the penitentiary, and for the white man who has given said Negroes free papers or aided in getting them off. These ads, they're not funny, they're absurd, right? And this was from November 4th, 1854, right? So when we start to think about this conversation between, incarceration and slavery, we have to really just look at the evidence, right? But the runaway ads are the clearest evidence that Black people were not patiently waiting for the end of slavery. Kin in one direction, property in another. All right. Where are we at? Next slide, please. Once again, kin in one direction. So we're kind of jumping a little bit into the 20th century here, just so we could get a sense of our current moment. And we didn't just, 1865 didn't just turn into 2020, right, overnight. And so I wanted to give us some sense of how Black people, Black leadership responded at different points. And in the 20th century, early 20th century, the World War I period, African communities were on the move throughout the world, right? These were folks who had gotten some education, or they had gotten some formal education, or they got labor education and began to organize, join collectives, join self-help organizations, benevolent societies, church groups, clubs, women's auxiliaries, things of this nature, to really try to frame some new possibilities for Black life at the turn of the 20th century, okay? So here's two examples from the Negro World. This is Marcus Garvey's newspaper, who was one of the leaders of the Pan-African movement. And of course, all these folks are moving with a particular kind of historical consciousness. New Negro Steamship Company secures first ship for Africa. Africa, the land of hope and promise for Negro peoples of the world, right? Will Negroes allow the whites to take Africa? This is Garvey. If you know anything about Garvey, he knew how to get the headline across. Next slide, please. Here is Dr. Du Bois, and both he and Garvey shared a similar vision and fought each other tooth and nail over that vision. And we don't have time to go into that, but this is his masterpiece, one of his masterpieces. I think this one is 1903, Souls of Black Folk, is one masterpiece. The other masterpiece, I believe, is The World in Africa, an inquiry into the role in which Africa played in the modern world. And that is published in 1944. Before that, a book called Black Reconstruction, 1935. Those are three seminal texts that Dr. Du Bois put down, amongst many, many other writings. And of course, knowing anything about the NAACP, Du Bois was there at the founding, and also was its first editor of the Crisis magazine. Next slide, please. Du Bois posed this wonderful and intriguing and difficult question: how does it feel to be a problem? And he believed that that kind of summed up how the world saw Black people as a problem to be solved. Next slide, please. Ida B. Wells, we have to mention her and her work around lynching. And really, she did a lot in terms of independent newspapers, journalism, just all around force of nature. But I believe her particular contribution on the question of lynching, how to reframe this argument that the reason why many Black men were being lynched was because they were chasing white women. She dispelled that and had the evidence to support it. And so she came with the conclusion that it was economic competition that led to many of the lynchings that we will see in the 20th century. Next slide, please. 1919 was known as the Red Summer. And this is many of the things that Ida B. Wells was talking about. But we know some of these places. We might know what happened in Chicago. We might know what happened in East St. Louis. Clearly, folks in this region will. And if you're from any of these areas, there's probably some consciousness that, there was a race riot here. And what the historians used to call race riots, we have to reframe them. One of my colleagues, DeRoy in Massachusetts, uses the term pogroms, right? Because these were opportunities for white vigilante groups, mobs, in fact, to go into Black communities and destroy property and destroy people. Now, of course, Black people fought back at times, sometimes better than others. And so you will find in the historical record white casualties as well. But the point is that by and large, these were white vigilante groups going into Black communities and basically trying to run them out. And so this was known as the Red Summer 1919. Of course, it's coming after World War I. And many African Americans were, in fact, trying to exercise their citizenship rights as the best as they could. Many of these were veterans or families of veterans, and they were run out of these places. Most of these had to do with the assertion of labor rights. And once Black people try to organize and stand up for themselves, then this is how they were met, with riots and get out of town and you're taking my money and all this kind of stuff. And one of the most vicious of these was the Elaine, Arkansas pogrom in 1919. And so that's, if we go to the next slide, we can see this was clearly over well, maybe not clearly, but this particular case was over a labor dispute. And so local folk thought that these folks were basically inspired by, some outside agitators, right? We know all this language. This language has become fixed in our political imaginary, right? Outside agitators coming to unionize folk. And more importantly, they came up with the idea that there was a threat that these folk who were trying to unionize were actually going to set off a race riot. So they basically lied as a justification to go in and destroy the Black community in Elaine, Arkansas, right, 1919. These folk that we see pictures before us were the unfortunate casualties of a racist judicial system that found them all guilty of whatever crimes were alleged, even though there was no evidence. This has been a case that had been studied on and off throughout the late 20th century. And it was only until last year that Elaine, Arkansas actually recognized the fallacy of this and how, in fact, these 12 individuals were wrongfully executed, all right, legally executed, all for attending a meeting to talk about wages, sharecropper wages, right? So there's a labor dispute, it's an economic dispute. And it's a democratic dispute, right? What does democracy mean if we can't protect our labor, right? This is what the question was for them. Next slide, please. So thanks to Ida B. Wells and her colleagues, this was a broadside that the NAACP circulated, and they began counting, and trying to keep track of how many people were lynched. And so you might remember those iconic images in black and white where the NAACP would hang a flag outside of its office in New York saying a man was lynched today, to really dramatize and make sure the public understood that somebody was watching what was happening to Black people. It says, do you know that the United States is the only land on the earth where human beings are burned at the stake, right? Right, because this is supposed to be a land of civilization, right? So how are we burning and castrating and chopping off limbs and taking them as souvenirs? But they had counted, over 3,400 folks had been lynched between 1889 and 1922. And I'm sure they were still counting. Is rape the cause of lynching, right? And then they have, how that's dispelled. How do the lynchers go unpunished, et cetera? All this to maintain civilization in America, right? You can't escape your responsibility. This kind of very direct, kind of way they're challenging the civil society, challenging the public, right? All right, next slide. I'm trying to show a continuation of struggle, and this is one of the books that really doesn't get a lot of attention. And I know we're coming towards the end, so just bear with me, please. We Charge Genocide, 1951. This was initiated by the Civil Rights Congress, led by a man named William Patterson, all right? And William Patterson gathered many of his friends. Patterson assembled this document. This document basically cataloged in the 1940s, all the way up to 1951, the attacks on Black life, as much as he could find, all the evidence that he could find. And this was delivered as a petition to the United Nations. Some of the people who signed this were Paul Robeson and his wife, Islanda Robeson, Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois, Alpheus Hunton, Dorothy Hunton, right? So these are some well-known folks over the Black left, and they had petitioned to the world, on the world stage, to pay attention to what was happening to African Americans in the United States. And this was obviously not greeted favorably by the United States government, of course, but they republished it 20 years later with, as you can see, with the preface by Ossie Davis, who, if you watch any Spike Lee movies up until more recently, Ossie Davis had some kind of feature in all of the films. And Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee were hardcore civil rights activists associated with many folks on the left and in progressive movements throughout the country and indeed throughout the world. And We Charge Genocide is a document. And just to give you one case from our home front, if we go to our next slide, this was published in We Charge Genocide. August 11, 1949, James Perry, a 41-year-old Negro, unemployed war veteran, died in Homer G. Phillips Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri, after being beaten by 4 police officers. The cause of death was listed as intracranial hemorrhage. Perry had been picked up by the 4 police on a complaint of a park watchman who tried to evict Perry from a small park in the Negro section at 4 p.m. that afternoon. Police later claimed that he had stolen soda from a soda wagon, but the vendor testified it had been stolen by children. So a 41-year-old unemployed war veteran dies over soda, 1949. Next slide. So here we are, Juneteenth, right? I know you probably wanted some pom-poms. You probably wanted the float, the RBG float, but you got all this. You got lynchings, and you got slavery, and you got transatlantic slavery, right? And it's unfortunate, but it's a history that we really have to grapple with, right? So how do we institutionalize the memory of these things? We've seen in the last couple of weeks, the tremendous work of many activists actually materializing in the removal of statues of colonial people, colonial leaders, colonial thinkers, racist agitators, white supremacists who were also in our government. Those statues are starting to come down, right? NASCAR banned the Confederate flag. I'm not going to act like that's not huge, okay? I'm just not. So how do we continue this work, right? Because this is a work of continuing to really reveal who this country, this part of the world, this sliver of humanity, who we are to the world. And so part of commemoration, part of history is to really grapple with the ugly moments, right? To really include the ugly moments in our state making, in our nation making, in the consciousness of who we are. So this is why Juneteenth is becoming more and more popular in terms of getting attention. Now, whether or not it will force states to include this as a state holiday, as Pennsylvania did last year, right? I believe Missouri is also a state where Juneteenth is a state holiday. There's many other, but there's not a federal holiday. So that's the question, whether or not this history needs to be risen to the level of federal recognition. I believe it does. I would support that. But I would also say, and I hope that you understand that anything that I've said during this time means that understanding history and understanding information is not enough. Unless we transform the structures that opened up the opportunity for someone to get beaten and killed by police over a soda, right? What are the conditions that need to be changed that allow that to happen? So when we're talking about these holidays, yes, we should remember our history and commemorate the struggle of all of our pioneers and all of our ancestors. But for the general public to believe that the symbolic gesture is all we need right now is to totally miss the point. So if we go to our next slide, just yesterday, because everything is real time right now, just yesterday, I heard a wonderful interview with Eve Ewing, who's a poet and sociologist out of Chicago. And she's on Fresh Air, one of my favorite shows with Terry Gross, Represent. And Terry asked her, so what do we do now that we know, about what's going on in the world? And she, kind of jumped in as soon as the question ended. Eve Ewing jumped in and says, yes, I am 120% talking about material reparations, right? We cannot, in this moment or going forward, be afraid of that word as it relates to Black people. Americans have been afraid of that word. And so because of that, we get George Floyd. Because of that, we get police unions who are resistant to change. Because of that, we get people dying left and right. So the point is that without the material reparation, the symbolic gesture is empty and it's incomplete. And we have to accept that fact. Next slide, please. So what will Juneteenth mean to you? I always want to leave you with something. Will it continue to mean denial and erasure of African people's contribution, their history? Will it be about revision so that America could feel great and suppression of the actual story? Will it be about cemented inequity, right, and continuation, right? Because that's one of the tricks of our society, one of the conundrums, the great conundrum of our society is to have technology like this that allows us to engage and still, right, and that technology can be a sign of progress and still have these racial logics that play out in the street. Or will Juneteenth represent truth and reconciliation, reparations and justice, and a renewed movement? I believe that's our choice. I believe that's our obligation in this moment and going forward. Next slide, please. History is not so much lost as it is ignored. So some of this stuff we know, but we just haven't done much about it. Next slide. Resources for further research. I mentioned John Hope Franklin, In Search of the Promised Land is one. He's written many, many books. Kelly Carter Jackson has a wonderful new book called Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Definitely want you to check that out. And one of my favorite books that helps to contextualize 20th century social policy is Khalil Gibran Muhammad's book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Urban America. Wonderful book that will help us understand the role between racist thinking and social policy and the way in which Black people get blamed for their conditions. And he lays that whole history out in fine detail. And then the final piece that I have there, and I could supply many more resources, but this is just for today, is the Jackson Cush Plan, which is out of Jackson, Mississippi, cooperationjackson.org. Read that plan, economic justice, environmental justice, racial justice, all intersecting, right, in a Southern state, right, which is critical. So with that, we'll end our presentation. I believe that's my last slide. Thank you for bearing with our technical difficulties, but as you know, we just keep it rolling. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tinson. That was a wonderful presentation. There was a lot of information that you went over. So I'm sure some of our visitors have questions.
I'm sure.
So
we have time for a few or a couple.
We do. We have time for a few questions. I did notice that someone had their hand raised. I'm not sure if you lowered your hand, but if you can just type your question into the Q&A box, that would be most helpful. So we'll give that person an opportunity to populate her question here.
Sure.
And while we wait, okay, here it is. Oh, well, Krista says, thank you for an excellent presentation. I'm so glad I had a chance to get the reading list.
Excellent.
Okay. I did want to know if you could just spend a little bit of time talking about Tulsa. So Tulsa keeps coming up, 60 Minutes did their piece on it earlier this week. And I was wondering if you could just kind of connect the dots there as well.
In terms of reparations?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, that's the clearest example. It's not the only example, but it's the clearest example. And I want to say I must have Tulsa on that list. And if I didn't, please forgive me. But yeah, Tulsa is incredibly important. You're talking about Black migration across to the West, right? From East to West. You're talking about Black entrepreneurialism. You're talking about Black self-help organizations. What you're talking about is Black self-determination, in fact. And people were resistant, right, to that idea. It represented a threat to the social order. And so Tulsa becomes this place that's of great promise and great hope and opportunity for many folks, that ends up being destroyed, right? That ends up being taken from Black people pushed out, et cetera. So this is, again, I mean, the point that I want to, and legal scholars have actually taken up and done some great work on, the pros and cons of reparations, and you have used Tulsa as, Black Wall Street, Tulsa as a case study, and I think certainly so. I mean, I don't know what's happened since in terms of commemoration. I haven't seen the 60 Minutes piece yet, but absolutely Tulsa is one of those clear examples of where something considered reparations is needed. And if it's already been engaged, then more is needed. So Tulsa was definitely part of that, those programs that we listed early on.
Thank you so much. Okay, Dr. Chenson, we have a few questions here. So Kate would like to know, how did Stevie Wonder give us MLK Day?
Well, that's an interesting story. I mean, he wrote a song, right? Like, it sounds crazy, but it's Stevie Wonder. And he wrote the Happy Birthday song that we sing. So we call it the Black Happy Birthday song. So it's like you sing your happy birthday regular. And then the second verse is always sang as the Stevie version. And y'all who on here know what I'm talking about. But yeah, Stevie Wonder lobbied folks, in fact. So there was a kind of political maneuvering, organizing agenda that he had, right? Which was about how to get this, one, write the song, get it popularized and played, but also use that as an attention grabber to say, why aren't we celebrating this person, right? I just think it's important because it's always, the state always likes to think that it got it right, that it was their idea. And I just like to point out that it was Stevie Wonder's idea. One of the last places that wanted to hold out was the state of Arizona. They did not want to, that's the one that comes to mind. There were a few others, but Arizona was vehement about not having a state holiday for Dr. King, okay? I believe they do have it now. I'm sure they have it now, even though I haven't looked. But the point is that there was an organizing campaign. He rose awareness around it by writing the song. And then that triggered people really saying, yeah, this is a good idea. We should do this. How could we not? But it wasn't the federal government's first idea. And in fact, we could talk about King a little bit. I mean, we love King. That's why I mentioned King at the top. We love King. People love talking about King. King scared everybody when he came to town. Scared everybody. Police, everybody. Citizens, folks were like, okay, this is about to pop off when King gets in town. And here's the apostle of peace, right? But he represented such a force, a moral force, a raging and righteously raging force for justice, that it scared the status quo no matter where he went. And, we kind of know how that history went, but let's not act like, people love King from the day he stepped on the national scene.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next question comes from Lloyd. He said, please be specific with examples of each of your terms for what we can do.
Terms?
I
the
think,
terms at the end, like denial,
yeah.
And all that?
Yeah.
Yeah, can you go back to that slide?
Sure.
Because I just want to make sure we're specific. Yeah, I think it's the one before this one. Or maybe not. Yeah, this one here. No, I'm gonna just focus on the blue real quick. I mean, look, the reparations piece is actually, there's a wonderful new book. Listen, I'm a scholar. I'm always refer you to stuff. There's a new book by Professor Darity from Duke, William Darity from Duke, who really historicizes and actually comes up with a strategy for reparations, for actual payment or a series of payments that lead to institutions being created and scholarships and bonds and all kind of based on our capitalist economic structure. He has detailed a particular strategy. That book just came out in 2020, okay? It's not the first time that this question of reparations has been on the table, But when we say specifically reparations, at the root of reparations is this question of repair. And some people would consider, reparations as a kind of do no more harm going forward position. But at the heart of it is this question of repair. So how do you repair? How do you solve inequity in economics? How do you solve inequity in politics? Reparations gets at all of that, right? But the economic piece is what scares people from talking about it. It's what breaks down the conversation. And I'm just saying we need to just go full throttle at that particular aspect of it. Let's just talk about the economics of it. And that's beyond the scope of our time today, but I'll be happy to come back and, maybe we could do a panel just on reparations. I would love to do that with the museum. And then Truth and Reconciliation, that comes out of South Africa. So, folks need to, we look abroad for examples of inspiration as well. And so the question is, having a full Truth and Reconciliation Commission to really look at these things would be something that I think would better prepare us to figure out what we should do. But go back and look at the testimonies of Ta-Nehisi Coates and others who went before Congress last year to debate this question of reparations specifically and compellingly, right? So this is, and again, at the top of this presentation, I'm gonna just say it again. I'm not trying to convince folks. If you're not convinced by now that something's wrong and that something needs to be done, I don't know where you've been. And so I don't mean that to be flippant or rude or to ignore what's being asked, but it is to say that the examples have been there for decades for what we could do, right? We could stop doing voter suppression. We could stop, right, blaming people and criminalizing them when they're killed, right? We could do things like that. So Truth and Reconciliation is a model that gets at clearing all of the dirty laundry, if you will, about what states have done to preserve a particular power dynamic that has led to destruction of Black possibility. So that's the Truth and Reconciliation. I can't be more specific about that. There's a whole body of literature on that. And reparations, if you want to start with Professor Darity's book, you can start there. There's a great book about debating reparations by Raymond Winbush. When I teach reparations, I use that. Should America Pay is the name of that book, and that came out in the 90s. So, this question of reparations and justice has been on our table for a while, and I just want to hone in on that one. The ones in white are just kind of my way of saying this is where we're at. Our status right now is around denial of these histories, erasing these histories, revising them to serve our interests, et cetera. And here I'm speaking of top down from the country, our educational system, the structures, not individuals who may know this or that. I hope that's clear. And if you want, you can email me for more conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Tinson. I think you covered some of the questions that we have listed here. I'm going to take one more.
Sure.
This one says, thank you, Dr. Tinson, for your great presentation. Do you know whether institutions such as SLU have and are implementing any form of reparations?
Not at the moment, but let's just say we'd be happy to have that conversation. I don't want to put anybody out there on Front Street right now, but I think we'd be happy to have that kind of a conversation. And you can find this online, so this is not anything revealing in particular, but there's a Slavery History and Memory Reconciliation Project that started by the Edgewood Province, and they have a whole list of things that they're trying to do right now, and we're working in concert with them, but also locally on our own thing. And I should also mention there's a whole organization, called the Universities Studying Slavery. And so these are all universities who've been willing to dig into their history, much like Brown did, Brown University, Princeton, Yale. But like I said, these are things that we can go and find. They're here, and I just want us to understand the larger background to Juneteenth. It's more than about the celebration. It's more than about the symbolism and making ourselves feel good. It's about dealing with the difficult, muddy history of this country and figuring out how committed we can be to a just future.
And possibly exploring organizations locally, the Organization for Black Struggle. There's definitely local resources that you can tap into and become a part of the movement in that way if you see fit.
Right on.
Dr. Tenson, thank you so much. You always answer the call whenever we ask, and you always come through and you educate us on a deeper level, and I greatly appreciate it. What I will take away from this presentation, you said understanding the history is not enough. We have to understand the conditions that brought us here and that need to be changed. So I implore all of you to think about his sentiments as you go on through your day. As we approach Juneteenth, think about what this means to you, how you could possibly change your own trajectory, how you can change your own thinking, and how you can help and be a part of this international movement that is taking place. History is being made right before our eyes. And again, Dr. Tenson, I just thank you for breaking it down for us in that way. And I look forward to another presentation with you very soon.
Absolutely.
I have this slide up here. If you are interested in supporting any of our other programs, please visit us on mohistory.org and learn more about our St. Louis Live program, St. Louis History Live programs. And I'm gonna stop bumping my gums because I have so much in my brain right now, thanks to Dr. Tenson. And thank you to our virtual guests for joining us.
Absolutely.
We hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, and I hope this carries you through the weekend. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.